The amber glow of kerosene lamps cast dancing shadows across the weathered floorboards of the Silver Dollar Saloon. Clara's voice rose above the din of clinking glasses and rough laughter, her melody threading through the thick air like a silver ribbon through burlap. She stood on the small wooden stage, her emerald dress catching the light, worn but still elegant against the crude backdrop of spittoons and sawdust. The year was 1890, and Dust Creek sat like a festering wound on the edge of the Sonoran Desert. The town had sprouted from nothing more than a waterhole and a dream of gold that never materialized. Now it survived on cattle drives, desperate men, and the kind of commerce that thrived in the shadows of civilization. Clara's fingers gripped the edge of her shawl as she sang, her voice never betraying the tremor in her hands. Each night was the same ritual of fear and necessity. The men who filled the saloon, cowboys, drifters, gamblers, and worse, watched her with eyes that ranged from appreciation to hunger. She had learned to read those looks, to navigate them like a ship through dangerous waters. "That's my songbird," called out Jake Morrison, the saloon's owner, from behind the bar. His thick mustache twitched as he grinned, gold tooth glinting. He was the closest thing to protection she had in this town, though his protection came with its own price, half her earnings and the understanding that she belonged to the Silver Dollar as surely as the bottles behind the bar. As Clara began her next song, a ballad about lost love that she'd learned from a traveling medicine show, her eyes swept across the room. The usual faces stared back. Tom Brennan, the town drunk who'd once been a respected rancher before drought took his land. The Colton brothers, card sharps who drift through every few months to fleece the locals, and Deputy Barnes, who spent more time in the saloon than patrolling the streets. The air hung thick with the smell of tobacco smoke, cheap whiskey, and the ever-present dust that seemed to coat everything in Dust Creek. Outside, the desert wind rattled the saloon's windows, carrying with it the distant howl of coyotes and the promise of another scorching day to come. Clara had arrived in Dust Creek 6 months ago, stepping off a dusty stagecoach with nothing but a carpetbag and a carefully constructed story. She was a widow. She told anyone who asked. Her husband killed in a mining accident back east. The truth was far darker. She was running from a marriage that had nearly killed her, from a man whose cruelty was matched only by his influence. Samuel Hartley wasn't the kind of man who let his possessions go easily. And in the eyes of the law, that's exactly what she was. His possession. The bruises had long since faded, but the scars ran deeper than skin. She'd learned to hide them beneath powder and rouge, behind smiles and songs. Music had become her armor, each performance a small act of defiance against the fear that stalked her like a shadow. Between songs, she noticed the saloon doors swing open. The conversation didn't stop. It rarely did for just another cowboy looking for whiskey and cards. But Clara's practiced eye caught the subtle shift in the room's energy. Some men had a presence that changed the air around them, and this stranger was one of them. He stood in the doorway for a moment, silhouetted against the dying light outside. Dust clung to his long duster coat, and his hat sat low over his face. When he moved into the light, Clara saw a man who wore the trail like a second skin. His clothes spoke of weeks in the saddle leather chaps scarred by mesquite thorns, boots worn down at the heels, a gun belt that sat easy on his hips like it belonged there. But it was his eyes that made her fingers stumble on the opening notes of her next song. They were the color of winter sky, gray-blue and distant, carrying the weight of too many miles and too many midnights. When those eyes found hers across the smoky room, Clara felt something shift in her chest, recognition not of the man, but of the pain he carried. She recovered quickly, her voice finding its strength as she launched into Red River Valley, a favorite among the cowboys. The stranger made his way to the bar, his spurs singing a quiet metallic song with each step. He moved with the economy of someone who'd learned not to waste energy, each gesture deliberate and contained. "Whiskey," she heard him say to Jake, his voice carrying despite its quiet tone. It was a voice roughened by dust and disuse, the voice of a man who spent more time talking to horses than people. Coming right up, friend, Jake replied, already reaching for a bottle. Don't believe I've seen you in Dust Creek before. Just passing through. The stranger laid coins on the bar. Exact change. Nothing more. Well, you picked a good night. That's Clara singing finest voice this side of the Colorado River. Came to us from back east. Poor thing. Lost her husband. You know? The stranger's only response was a slight nod as he accepted his drink. He didn't turn to watch her perform like the others did, but Clara could feel his awareness like heat from a distant fire. He stood at the bar, one boot hooked on the rail, seemingly focused on the amber liquid in his glass. As she finished her song to scattered applause and a few tossed coins, Clara gathered her skirts to step down from the stage. This was always the worst part, navigating through the crowd to collect her earnings, dodging grabbing hands and lewd suggestions. She'd learned to move quickly, to keep her smile fixed and her responses light. How about a private song? Pretty bird, slurred Tom Brennan, reaching for her arm. Clara sidestepped smoothly. Now, Tom, you know, mister, Morrison doesn't allow private performances. Come on now, just one little... The lady said no. The voice cut through Tom's wheedling like a blade through rope. The stranger hadn't moved from his position at the bar, hadn't even turned around, but something in his tone made Tom's hand drop to his side. Wasn't talking to you, cowboy. Tom muttered, but the fight had gone out of his voice. Wasn't talking to you either, the stranger replied, finally turning. The movement was unhurried, almost lazy, but Clara recognized the coiled readiness in it. This was a man who'd learned to be dangerous without telegraphing it. Tom looked from the stranger to Clara, then back again. Whatever he saw in those gray-blue eyes made him think better of pressing the issue. He turned back to his drink with a muttered curse. Clara felt she should say something, thank the stranger. Perhaps, but the words stuck in her throat. Instead, she gathered the coins from the stage and made her way to the bar to give Jake his cut. 50-50, like always, Jake said, counting out the coins with practiced fingers. You did good tonight. Clara, keep them coming back. She nodded, pocketing her share. It wasn't much, but it was honest money, earned by her own voice rather than stolen in the dead of night like when she'd fled Samuel. She'd sold her wedding ring in Tucson, used the money for stage fare and a few weeks' lodging. Now she survived on her voice and her wits, and if both sometimes felt stretched thin, at least they were hers to command. The stranger had returned his attention to his drink, but as Clara passed behind him to reach the stairs, he spoke without turning. You sing like someone who knows what it means to lose something. The words stopped her cold, not because they were forward or inappropriate, but because they were true. She turned to find him watching her in the mirror behind the bar, those storm-colored eyes seeing too much. We've all lost something out here, she managed, her carefully neutral tone at odds with the racing of her heart. That we have, he agreed, raising his glass in a small salute before draining it. Clara fled up the stairs to her small room above the saloon, her feet knowing each creaking board by heart. Only when she closed and latched the door did she allow herself to breathe fully. She moved to the window, pushing aside the faded calico curtain to look down at the street. Dust Creek at night was a different creature than during the day. Shadows pooled in the spaces between buildings like dark water, and the desert wind carried sounds that made her shiver. Distant gunshots, maybe, or just cowboys letting off steam. The town had no proper law except Deputy Barnes, and he was more interested in his whiskey than keeping peace. She watched a figure emerge from the saloon, the stranger, his duster coat billowing behind him as he walked. He paused in the street, looking up, and for a moment she thought he might have seen her at the window. Then he turned and walked toward the boarding house, his form swallowed by the darkness between the buildings. Clara let the curtain fall and began preparing for bed, her hands moving through the familiar ritual of removing pins from her hair, hanging up her dress, washing the paint from her face. But her mind kept returning to those knowing eyes, to the way he'd said lost something like he understood the weight of those words. She'd been so careful these past months, never staying too long in one place until Dust Creek, never letting anyone get close enough to ask real questions. But something about the stranger made her feel exposed, as if he could see through her careful construction of Clara the widow to the frightened woman beneath. As she lay in her narrow bed, listening to the sounds of the saloon below, the laughter growing rougher as the night wore on, the occasional crash of broken glass, Jake's booming voice restoring order, Clara found herself thinking about the stranger, Luke. She'd heard someone call him as she was leaving. Luke something or other. Just another drifter in a town full of them. But she knew better. Whatever had brought him to Dust Creek, it wasn't chance. Men like that, men who carried their pain like a weapon, who moved through the world like ghosts. They were running from something too. The question was whether what chased him was worse than what chased her. Outside her window, a screech owl called, its cry piercing the night like a portent. Clara pulled her thin blanket higher and closed her eyes, but sleep was a long time coming. In her dreams, she was running again, but this time through a landscape of red rock and endless sky. And somewhere in the distance, a man in a dusty coat kept pace with her, neither catching up nor falling behind. When morning came, it would bring the harsh light of another desert day, the struggle to survive in a town that chewed up the weak and spat them out. But for now, in the darkness of her small room, Clara allowed herself one dangerous thought. What if she didn't have to run alone? The morning sun painted Dust Creek in shades of ochre and rust, revealing the town's wounds that darkness had hidden. Luke Castellan stood on the porch of Mason's boarding house, rolling a cigarette with practiced fingers while his eyes tracked the early morning activity. Shopkeepers swept dust from their doorways in a futile daily ritual. And somewhere a rooster crowed, defiant against the desert's attempt to silence all life. He'd taken a room at Mason's because it stood kitty corner from the Silver Dollar, offering a clear view of anyone coming or going. Old habits died hard, and Luke had lived too long by watching his back to stop now. The mountain trails had taught him that survival often depended on seeing trouble before it saw you. Word traveled fast in a town like Dust Creek, faster than tumbleweeds in a desert wind. By the time Luke made his way to the general store for supplies, folks were already talking. That new fellow, the one who faced down Tom Brennan last night, he heard Mrs. Pritchard whisper to her daughter behind the dry goods counter. Rode in from the Superstition Mountains. They say nobody comes from there unless they're running from something or looking for something that don't want to be found. Luke selected his purchases methodically. Coffee, jerky, ammunition for his Colt .45, the essentials of a man who might need to leave quickly. He'd learned long ago that roots were a luxury he couldn't afford, not since that day 3 years back when he'd failed to protect the only family he had left. That'll be $2.30, Mrs. Pritchard said, her eyes trying to read his story in the lines of his weathered face. He paid without comment and gathered his goods. As he stepped back into the harsh morning light, his attention was drawn to a figure crossing the street. Clara moved differently in daylight, carefully, like someone navigating a field of broken glass. She wore a simple calico dress, faded but clean, and a bonnet that couldn't quite hide the rich auburn of her hair. Without the paint and feathers of her evening persona, she looked younger, more vulnerable. She was heading toward the Mercantile, a basket over her arm. But her path was blocked by 3 cowboys lounging against a hitching post. Luke recognized the type young, bored, and mean with it. They'd probably been drinking all night and were looking for sport. Well, the tallest one drawled, stepping into her path. The songbird's out of her cage. How about singing us a morning tune? Pretty thing. Please excuse me, Mr. Dalton, Clara said, her voice steady but her knuckles white on the basket handle. I have errands to attend to. Oh, come on now, Dalton persisted, his friends flanking her. We paid good money to hear you sing last night. Least you could do is be friendly. Luke found himself moving before he'd made a conscious decision. He'd spent 3 years avoiding other people's troubles, but something about the way Clara held herself, straight-backed despite her fear, stirred an echo of the man he used to be. Morning, ma'am, he said, touching the brim of his hat as he approached. "Mrs. Mason asked me to escort you to the store. Said she had some fabric samples you wanted to see." Clara's eyes widened slightly at the lie, but she was quick enough to play along. "Of course, I'd forgotten. Thank you, Mr. Castellan," he supplied, offering his arm. "Luke Castellan." She took it, and he could feel the tremor in her grip. Together they walked past the Cowboys, who were smart enough not to challenge a man who moved like Luke did. He could feel their eyes burning holes in his back, but he'd faced down worse than small-town bullies. They walked in silence until they reached the Mercantile's entrance. Only then did Clara release his arm and turn to face him. "Thank you," she said simply. "Though I suspect Mrs. Mason knows nothing about fabric samples. She might be surprised to learn about it herself." Luke admitted. A ghost of a smile crossed her face, there and gone like a desert flower. "You didn't have to intervene. I've dealt with worse than the Dalton boys." "I know," he said, and something in his tone made her look at him sharply. "But that doesn't mean you should have to." They stood there for a moment. Two people who understood that kindness in a hard world was both precious and dangerous. Then Clara nodded and disappeared into the store, leaving Luke standing in the dusty street with the uncomfortable feeling that he'd just taken a step toward something he'd been running from for years. The day wore on with the relentless heat that made even breathing feel like work. Luke spent it the way he'd planned, checking his horse at the livery, having his tack repaired. All the preparations of a man who'd learned to be ready to ride at a moment's notice. But his thoughts kept returning to a pair of green eyes that held too many shadows. As evening approached and the sun began its bloody descent toward the horizon, Luke found himself back at the Silver Dollar. He told himself it was for the whiskey, that Mason's boarding house didn't serve liquor and a man had a right to a drink after a long day. But when Clara took the stage in a dress of deep burgundy, when her voice filled the room with a lament about love and loss, he knew he was lying to himself. Tonight's crowd was rougher than the previous evening. A cattle drive had ended that afternoon, and cowboys with 3 months' wages burning in their pockets filled every chair and lined the bar 3 deep. The air crackled with the dangerous energy of men looking to celebrate or fight, whichever came first. Clara's voice never wavered, but Luke could see the tension in her shoulders, the way her eyes tracked the room like a deer scenting wolves. Jake Morrison worked the bar with grim efficiency, his shotgun visible beneath the counter. Even Deputy Barnes seemed more alert, though that might have been because he was only on his 3rd whiskey instead of his usual 6th. Trouble came during Clara's 3rd song. A big man, trail boss by the look of his clothes and attitude, pushed through the crowd to stand directly in front of the stage. "Sing Lorena," he demanded, tossing a silver dollar at her feet. "And sing it like you mean it." Clara bent to retrieve the coin, and Luke saw her hands shake. "I'm sorry, sir, but I don't know that one." "Don't know it?" The trail boss's face darkened. "Every songbird knows Lorena. You sing it for the boys who died wearing gray. You hear me?" The room went quiet, except for the creak of chairs as men shifted, choosing sides in a conflict that had supposedly ended 25 years ago, but still lived in the hearts of those who'd fought it. Luke set down his glass, calculating angles and distances with the part of his mind that never stopped planning for violence. "I said I don't know it," Clara repeated, her chin lifting with a defiance that Luke recognized would cost her. The trail boss reached for her, and that's when everything went to hell. Luke's glass shattered against the man's temple before his fingers could close on Clara's dress. The trail boss went down, and his crew surged forward. Someone threw a punch, someone else drew a knife, and within seconds the Silver Dollar erupted into the kind of brawl that would be talked about for years. Luke fought with economical precision, using furniture and other fighters as shields, never drawing his gun but making every blow count. His goal wasn't to win, but to reach Clara, who stood frozen on the stage as chaos exploded around her. A bottle whistled past his head, showering him with whiskey and glass. Someone's elbow caught him in the ribs, driving the air from his lungs. But he kept moving, He reached the stage just as one of the cowboys tried to climb up. Luke's boot caught the man in the jaw, sending him crashing back into a poker table. "We need to go," he shouted over the din, holding out his hand to Clara. She took it without hesitation, gathering her skirts as he pulled her down from the stage. Together they fought their way toward the back exit, Luke clearing a path with controlled violence while Clara stayed close behind him. They burst through the door into the alley, the cool night air a shock after the suffocating atmosphere inside. "This way!" Clara gasped, tugging him toward a narrow passage between buildings. They ran through the darkness, their footsteps echoing off adobe walls, until they reached a small courtyard behind the seamstress shop. Only then did they stop, both breathing hard. In the distance, they could hear whistles and shouts as Deputy Barnes and whatever help he could muster tried to restore order. Clara leaned against a wall, one hand pressed to her chest. In the moonlight, Luke could see tears tracking down her cheeks, though she made no sound. "You're hurt," she said, noticing blood on his shirt. "Not mine," he assured her, though his ribs protested the lie. "Are you all right?" "Yes, no, I don't know." She laughed, but it sounded more like a sob. "I can't go back there tonight. Jake will be furious. The damage." "Morrison's got bigger problems than one missing singer," Luke said. "That brawl's been brewing since the first Cowboy hit town. You just happened to be the spark that lit the fuse." They stood in silence, listening to the night sounds of Dust Creek distant shouts, breaking glass, a dog barking somewhere. Finally, Clara pushed herself away from the wall. "I should go, find somewhere to stay until—" "Mason's has rooms." Luke found himself saying, "It's respectable, safe." She looked at him, and in the moonlight, he could see her wrestling with trust and necessity. "Why are you helping me?" It was a fair question, one he'd been asking himself. "Maybe because I know what it's like to have nowhere safe to go," he said finally. "Maybe because I'm tired of walking past folks who need help and telling myself it's not my problem. And maybe because you're running from something too," she said softly. It wasn't a question. Luke thought of his brother Daniel, of the ambush he should have seen coming, of the guilty men who walked free while an innocent one lay in the ground. "Maybe that too," he admitted. They made their way to Mason's boarding house through back alleys and side streets, avoiding the main thoroughfare where the fight had likely spilled out of the saloon. Mrs. Mason, a thin woman with sharp eyes and a sharper tongue, took one look at them and asked no questions beyond whether Clara could pay for a week in advance. "Room 7, she said, handing over a key. "No visitors after 9, no liquor, no loud noise. Breakfast is at 6 if you want it." Clara clutched the key like a lifeline. "Thank you," she said to both Mrs. Mason and Luke. As she climbed the stairs, Luke called after her. "What will you do now?" She paused, looking back over her shoulder. "What I always do, survive until tomorrow, then survive the day after that." After she disappeared down the hallway, Luke stood in the boarding house parlor, feeling strangely untethered. He'd kept to himself for 3 years, never staying long enough to learn names or care about faces. But something about Clara made him want to break that rule, and that scared him more than any barroom brawl. Outside, Dust Creek was settling into an uneasy quiet. The fight would be the talk of the town tomorrow, and Clara's part in it wouldn't be forgotten. She'd need more than a boarding house room to keep her safe if the wrong people decided to hold grudges. Luke climbed the stairs to his own room, his body beginning to catalog the various aches and pains from the fight. Tomorrow he should leave, head back to the mountains where the only company was wind and stone. It's what he'd done in every town for 3 years. Arrive, rest, resupply, and leave before anyone could matter. But as he lay in his narrow bed, listening to the night sounds of the town, he found himself thinking about green eyes filled with shadows and a voice that sang of loss with too much understanding. Whatever had brought him to Dust Creek, it wasn't finished with him yet. In room 7, Clara sat on the edge of her bed, still wearing her torn performance dress. She'd have to go back for her things eventually, face Jake's anger and the cowboy's resentment. But for tonight, she was safe behind a locked door, thanks to a stranger who fought like a man with his own ghosts. She thought about his words in the courtyard, about being tired of walking past folks who needed help. It had been so long since anyone had stood up for her without wanting something in return that she'd almost forgotten such kindness existed. But kindness in a place like Dust Creek came with a price, and she wondered what Luke Castellan's would be. Outside her window, a coyote howled, and others answered, their chorus rising into the star-filled sky. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new dangers, but tonight, for the first time in months, Clara allowed herself to hope that she might not have to face them alone. The desert morning brought whispers on the wind. Clara heard them drifting up from the boarding house dining room as she descended the stairs, her name tangled with speculation and judgment. The fight at the Silver Dollar had given the gossips enough ammunition to last through Sunday service. That singer from back east, Mrs. Pritchard's voice carried clearly. No decent widow would work in a saloon. Mark my words, there's more to her story than she's telling. Clara paused on the landing, her fingers white-knuckled on the banister. After 6 months of careful construction, her facade was beginning to crack. She forced herself to continue down, head high, meeting the sudden silence with practiced composure. Luke sat alone at a corner table, coffee steam rising before him like morning mist. He looked up as she entered, something knowing in those storm-gray eyes. Without a word, he pushed out the chair across from him with his boot. Mrs. Mason, Clara said, ignoring the stares. Might I have some coffee and bread? The boarding house owner, to her credit, simply nodded. Coming right up, dear. Clara sat across from Luke, aware of every eye in the room. You're either very brave or very foolish. Mr. Castellan. Been called both, he replied, his voice low enough that only she could hear, usually by the same people. The coffee arrived, and Clara wrapped her hands around the cup, letting its warmth seep into her bones. Through the window, she could see Jake Morrison standing outside the Silver Dollar, surveying the damage from last night's brawl. Even from here, his expression promised retribution. I need to find other employment, she said quietly. Jake won't take me back. Not after last night. Might be for the best, Luke observed. Man like Morrison. He sees people as property. You're better off free of him. Clara almost laughed at the word free. Freedom was a luxury she'd given up the day she'd said I do to Samuel Hartley in her father's Boston parlor. Everything since had been degrees of captivity. There's a wagon train, Luke continued, surprising her. Heading to California next week. They might need someone who can cook, help with the children. You've been asking around about wagon trains? A muscle tightened in his jaw. Man hears things. Town this size, information flows like water, whether you're looking for it or not. Before Clara could respond, the dining room door burst open. Tom Brennan stumbled in, his face showing the marks of last night's brawl. His bloodshot eyes found Clara immediately. There she is, he slurred, pointing an accusatory finger. The witch who started it all. Cost me a week's wages in that fight, and my brother's laid up with a busted head. Luke's hand moved toward his coffee cup, but his eyes never left Tom. The gesture was casual, but Clara had seen him fight. She knew how quickly casual could turn deadly. Seems to me, Luke said conversationally, a man who loses his wages in a brawl has only himself to blame. Tom's face flushed darker. Wasn't talking to you, Drifter. This is between me and the songbird. No, Clara said, finding her voice. It's not. I owe you nothing. Tom Brennan. Not an apology, not an explanation, and certainly not my time. The room held its breath. Women didn't speak to men that way in Dust Creek, especially not women who worked in saloons. Tom's hand drifted toward his hip, where a gun would have been if Mrs. Mason didn't enforce a strict no-weapons policy in her establishment. You'll regret that, Missy, he growled. This town's got a way of teaching uppity women their place. That's enough. Mrs. Mason appeared in the kitchen doorway. a rolling pin in her hand that she wielded like a club. "Tom Brennan, you're drunk and unwelcome. Get out before I have Deputy Barnes throw you in jail to dry out." Tom backed toward the door, his eyes never leaving Clara. "This ain't over," he promised before stumbling out into the morning glare. The dining room slowly returned to normal, though the whispers continued. Clara found her appetite had fled entirely. She pushed back from the table, but Luke's voice stopped her. "Running makes you look guilty," he said quietly. "Staying makes me a target," she countered. "You're already that." His words were harsh but not unkind. "Question is whether you face it alone or not." That evening, as the sun painted the desert in shades of blood and gold, Clara found herself walking with Luke along the outskirts of town. She'd spent the day in her room, alternating between planning her next escape and wondering why she hadn't already run. The answer walked beside her now, his presence both comforting and unsettling. "Tell me about your brother," she said, surprising them both. They'd been talking about inconsequential things, the weather, the landscape, anything but the weight they both carried. Luke's stride faltered for just a moment. "What makes you think I had a brother?" "The way you fight," Clara said. "Like someone who learned to protect before he learned to attack. And sometimes, when you think no one's looking, you get this expression like you're seeing ghosts." They walked in silence for a long moment, the only sound their boots on the hard-packed earth and the distant cry of a hawk. Finally, Luke spoke. "Daniel." His name was Daniel. The words came slowly, like blood from an old wound. 3 years younger, smart as a whip, could have been anything, doctor, lawyer, even a politician if he'd had the stomach for it. Instead, he wanted to be like his big brother, thought wearing a badge made you invincible. Clara waited, understanding that this story had its own pace. "We were deputies in Tucson." Luke continued. "Good at it, too. Cleaned up the worst parts of town. Put away men who'd been terrorizing folks for years, made enemies doing it, but we figured that came with the territory." His laugh was bitter. "Pride goeth before the fall," my mother used to say. They'd reached a cluster of rocks that offered shade from the dying sun. Luke sat, and after a moment, Clara joined him, careful to maintain a proper distance despite the intimacy of shared confessions. There was a rancher, Josiah Hawkins, rich, powerful, owned half the valley and wanted the other half. When settlers wouldn't sell, accidents would happen, fires, poisoned wells, missing cattle. We knew it was him, but knowing and proving are different things. "You went after him anyway." Clara said it wasn't a question. "Daniel found a witness, a ranch hand who'd seen too much and developed a conscience. We were supposed to meet him at an old mine shaft outside town. Get his testimony. Bring him in safe." Luke's hands clenched and unclenched rhythmically. It was an ambush. Hawkins's men were waiting. "Daniel. He pushed me out of the way of the first shot. Took the bullet meant for me." The desert stretched endlessly before them, and Clara thought about the weight of surviving when someone else didn't. She knew that burden intimately. "I killed 3 of them before the others ran," Luke said, his voice flat. Hawkins had an alibi, of course. Judge threw out the case, said there was no evidence connecting him to the ambush. "I turned in my badge that day. Left Tucson that night. Been drifting ever since." "Looking for what?" Clara asked softly. "Peace, maybe. Forgetting." He looked at her then, those gray eyes holding depth she hadn't seen before, but mostly just running, same as you. The comparison hung between them, an invitation and a challenge. Clara pulled her shawl tighter, though the evening was still warm. "My husband is alive," she said finally. "Samuel Hartley of the Boston Hartleys, respectable family, old money, perfect match according to my father." Her voice turned bitter. "No one mentions that old money often comes with old cruelties." Luke said nothing, but his attention was complete, the kind of listening that made words easier to speak. "The first time he struck me, I thought it was my fault. I'd contradicted him at a dinner party. You see, embarrassed him in front of his associates. Clara's fingers unconsciously traced her cheekbone, remembering. He was so apologetic afterward, swore it would never happen again, and I believed him because I needed to believe him. But it did happen again. Luke said, "Of course it did. It always does." Clara watched a roadrunner dart between cacti, swift and sure in its movements. Each time worse than the last, each time with a new excuse. I drank too much sherry. I smiled too long at the banker. I spent too much on ribbons. After a while, he stopped needing excuses. "Why didn't you leave sooner?" It was the question everyone asked, those who'd never been trapped in a cage of respectability and law. Where would I go? Samuel owns the police chief, the judges. In the eyes of the law, I belong to him like his horses or his houses. A wife who runs from her husband is a thief stealing herself. "So you ran anyway, after he broke my ribs." The words came out matter of fact, but Luke's sharp intake of breath showed he understood the pain behind them. "The doctors Samuel brought wouldn't meet my eyes. Just wrapped me up and told me to be more careful on the stairs. That's when I knew if I stayed, one day I wouldn't survive the stairs." The sun had set fully now, and the first stars were beginning to pierce the darkening sky. They should head back. The desert at night was no place for casual walks, but neither moved. I drugged his brandy. Clara continued. Laudanum from my medicine bottle. While he slept, I took what money I could find and my mother's jewelry, the pieces he hadn't already sold, caught the first train out of Boston, changed trains 3 times, changed my name twice. Clara Morgan is the 3rd woman I've been since leaving, and now he's looking for you. Samuel doesn't like to lose his possessions. Clara said, he has money, connections, Pinkerton detectives. Most likely, it's only a matter of time before they track me here. They sat in companionable silence. 2 people who'd shared their wounds and found them remarkably similar in shape, if not in detail. The desert night sounds began, the rustle of small creatures, the distant yip of coyotes, the whisper of wind through sage. That wagon train I mentioned, Luke said eventually, I've been thinking about California myself. Gold's played out, but there's other opportunities. Place where a man could start over. Maybe a woman, too. Clara turned to look at him. This dangerous man who'd appointed himself her protector for reasons she was only beginning to understand. Together, safer to travel in numbers, he said carefully. Lot of ground between here and California. Dangerous for folks traveling alone. It wasn't a declaration of anything more than practical companionship, but Clara heard the unspoken possibilities beneath the words. She thought about trust, about the courage it took to stop running alone and start running with someone else. I'll need to gather my things from the saloon, she said, and earn enough for supplies. The seamstress, Mrs. Chen, she's been looking for help. Respectable work, and she doesn't care about gossip. Clara smiled, the expression feeling foreign on her face. You've been busy planning my future, Mr. Castellan. Luke, he corrected. And I've been planning our future? Difference is significant. They walked back to town through the darkness, Luke's hand occasionally touching her elbow to guide her around obstacles. It was a simple courtesy, but Clara felt each touch like a brand. She'd fled one man's possession only to find herself gravitating toward another man's protection. The irony wasn't lost on her. But there was a difference, she realized, between a cage and a shelter. Samuel had trapped her. Luke was offering to walk beside her. The distinction might seem small to others, but to her, it was everything. As they reached the boarding house, Luke paused at the door. Whatever's coming, he said. You don't have to face it alone, not anymore. Clara met his eyes, seeing in them a promise that went beyond words. Neither do you, she replied. Inside, Mrs. Mason was waiting with a telegram, her expression grave. Clara's hands trembled as she took it, though she already knew what it would say. The message was brief, sent to her assumed name, but unmistakably from Samuel. Property will be recovered, agents en route. Husband's rights will be enforced. Luke read it over her shoulder, his presence solid and reassuring at her back. How long do we have? A week, maybe less if they're already in the territory. Clara crumpled the telegram, her fear crystallizing into determination. I won't go back. Luke, I'll die first. No, he said firmly, turning her to face him. You'll live. We both will. And we'll do it free. Looking into his eyes, Clara believed him. Tomorrow would bring new dangers, the threat of discovery, the challenge of escape. But tonight, she'd found something she'd thought lost forever, an ally, perhaps even more. In a world that seemed determined to cage her, she'd found someone willing to help her fly. The desert moon rose full and bright, casting silver light through the boarding house windows. Somewhere in the distance, a train whistle sounded, a reminder that the world beyond Dust Creek was vast and full of possibilities. Clara had been running toward something without knowing what it was. Now, looking at Luke, she began to understand that sometimes salvation came not from the destination but from the companion who walked beside you on the journey. The morning they appeared, Dust Creek lay beneath a copper sky that promised another day of merciless heat. Clara had been working at Mrs. Chen's seamstress shop for 3 days, her fingers remembering skills from a lifetime ago when embroidery was a leisure activity rather than survival. She was hemming a dress when the bell above the door chimed, and 2 men entered who didn't belong. They wore city clothes despite the desert heat, dark suits that marked them as outsiders as clearly as if they'd worn signs. The taller one had the lean, hungry look of a hunting dog, while his companion was built like a prize fighter gone to seed. Clara's needle slipped, drawing blood from her finger. Good morning, gentlemen. Mrs. Chen said in her careful English. How may I help you? The tall one produced a photograph from his vest pocket. We're looking for this woman, Mrs. Samuel Hartley. There's a reward for information leading to her safe return to her husband. Clara kept her head down, continuing her stitching with trembling hands. The photograph was from her wedding day. She looked young, hopeful, unaware of what awaited her. A different woman, entirely. Have not seen, Mrs. Chen said after barely glancing at it. Many women come through Dust Creek. They all look same to me. The shorter man's laugh was ugly. Now. No need to be unfriendly. We're just trying to reunite a husband and wife, Christian duty and all that. Still have not seen. Mrs. Chen repeated, returning to her work. Clara felt their eyes sweep the shop, lingering on her bent head. She forced herself to breathe normally, to keep her hands steady. After an eternity, she heard their footsteps retreat and the bell chime their departure. They will be back, Mrs. Chen said quietly once they were gone. Men like that, they smell fear like wolves smell blood. Clara looked up to find the older woman watching her with knowing eyes. I should leave. I don't want to bring trouble to you. Trouble finds its own way. Mrs. Chen replied. You stay. Finish dress. Then we talk. An hour later, Clara slipped out the back door, her pay in her pocket and her few belongings in a carpet bag. The streets felt different now. Hostile and exposed. Every face might be watching. Every corner might hide danger. She kept to the alleys, moving toward the boarding house where Luke would be waiting. She never made it. They caught her in the narrow passage behind the bakery, the same shortcut she'd taken for 3 days without incident. The tall one stepped out from behind a rain barrel, blocking her path, while heavy footsteps behind her announced his partner's presence. Mrs. Hartley, the tall one said, tipping his hat mockingly. Your husband's been worried sick. Time to come home. I'm not going anywhere with you, Clara said, proud that her voice didn't shake. Oh, but you are, the shorter one said, moving closer. See, we get paid whether you come willing or not. Your choice how pleasant the journey is. Clara's hand found the small knife in her pocket, the one she'd carried since Boston. I said no. The tall one sighed. Always have to make it difficult. He reached for her arm. The gunshot was impossibly loud in the confined space. The tall man jerked back, his hand going to his shoulder where a red stain was spreading. Luke stood at the alley entrance, his Colt steady in his hand, smoke curling from the barrel. The lady said no, Luke said calmly. I'd listen if I were you. The wounded man cursed, clutching his shoulder. His partner's hand moved toward his own weapon, but Luke's voice stopped him cold. Go ahead, give me a reason. You don't know who you're dealing with, cowboy, the shorter one snarled. This woman is legally married. You're interfering with the law. Funny thing about the law, Luke said, it gets real flexible out here in the territories. Now, you boys have two choices. You can get on your horses and ride out. Tell Hartley his wife died of fever. Tragic. But these things happen. Or you can stay and see how flexible the law gets when it comes to self-defense. The wounded man spat blood. Hartley will send more. He'll never stop looking. Then he'll waste a lot of money, Luke replied. Because after today, there won't be anyone to find. The two men looked at each other, calculating odds. Whatever they saw in Luke's eyes made the decision for them, supporting his wounded partner. The shorter man backed away. This isn't over. It is for you. Luke said, Don't come back to Dust Creek. Next time I won't aim for the shoulder. They watched the men stumble away. Then Luke turned to Clara. Pack light. We leave within the hour. The next hour passed in a blur. Clara gathered her meager possessions while Luke secured horses and supplies. Word of the confrontation spread like wildfire. Nothing stayed secret in Dust Creek for long. By the time they met at the livery stable, half the town seemed to be watching from doorways and windows. Where will we go? Clara asked as Luke helped her mount a sturdy mare. First, away from here, he said, swinging onto his own horse with practiced ease. Then we'll figure out the rest. They rode out as the sun reached its zenith, the heat shimmering off the desert floor in waves. Behind them, Dust Creek grew smaller until it was just another speck in the vast landscape. Clara didn't look back. She'd learned that survival meant always looking forward. They pushed hard through the afternoon, following trails that Luke seemed to know by instinct. He led them through arroyos and along ridgelines, always choosing paths that would be hard to track. As the sun began its descent, painting the rocks in shades of orange and red, they finally stopped at a cluster of boulders that formed a natural shelter. We'll rest here for a few hours, Luke said, helping her dismount. Eat something, water the horses, then we ride through the night. Clara's legs nearly buckled when they hit the ground. It had been years since she'd spent so long in the saddle. Luke steadied her with a hand on her elbow, his touch gentle despite the urgency of their situation. I'm slowing you down, she said, frustrated with her own weakness. No, he said firmly. You're keeping up just fine, tougher than you look. Clara Morgan. Reynolds, she corrected quietly. My maiden name was Clara Reynolds. I think I'd like to be her again. Luke smiled, the expression transforming his weathered features. Pleasure to meet you, Miss Reynolds. They made a cold camp, not risking a fire that might draw attention. As they shared jerky and hard biscuits, Clara studied the man who'd just upended his life for her. The setting sun caught the silver threads in his dark hair, highlighted the lines that spoke of laughter as well as sorrow. Why? She asked finally. You could have just ridden on. Let them take me. Luke was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. Then, my brother died because I failed to see danger coming, failed to protect him when it mattered most. I've been running from that failure for 3 years. He looked at her directly. Maybe I'm tired of running. Maybe I'm ready to stand and fight for something again. I'm not worth... Don't! His voice was sharp. Don't tell me what you're worth. I've seen you face down men twice your size without flinching. Seen you rebuild your life with nothing but determination and your own 2 hands. You're worth more than you know. Clara Reynolds. The moment stretched between them, charged with possibilities. Then Luke cleared his throat and stood. We should water the horses. Long ride ahead. They traveled through the night, the desert transformed into an alien landscape by moonlight. Saguaro cacti stood like silent sentinels, their arms reaching toward stars so bright they seemed close enough to touch. Luke navigated by those stars, leading them ever westward, away from the life that pursued them. As dawn broke, They were climbing into rougher country, the flat desert giving way to mesas and canyons. The horses were tired, and Clara swayed in her saddle, exhaustion pulling at her like an undertow. "There!" Luke pointed to a dark opening in the cliff face ahead. "Cave I used once before. We can rest. Hide the horses." The cave was deeper than it appeared, with a fresh water spring in the back. Someone had used it as a shelter before. There were remains of an old fire pit and even some supplies cached in the rocks. Luke tended to the horses while Clara collapsed onto a relatively flat section of ground. "Sleep," he told her. "I'll keep watch." "You need rest too," she protested weakly. "I'll rest when we're safer. Go on now." Clara was too tired to argue further. As she drifted off, she heard Luke moving around the cave, setting up defenses, preparing for trouble that might never come, or might be right behind them. His vigilance should have frightened her, reminded her of the danger they were in. Instead, she found it comforting. For the first time in longer than she could remember, someone else was standing guard. She could finally, truly rest. She woke to the sound of gunfire echoing off canyon walls. Luke was pressed against the cave entrance, his rifle in hand. "Stay down," he commanded without looking back. "They found us faster than I expected." Clara crawled to where her carpet bag lay, pulling out the small pistol Luke had given her in Dust Creek. She'd hoped never to use it, but hope was a luxury they couldn't afford. "How many?" she asked. "4, maybe 5. Different group than yesterday. Hartley must have hired every gun he could find." Another volley of shots peppered the rocks around the cave entrance. Luke returned fire, his shots deliberate and spaced. Clara heard a cry of pain from outside. "Clara Reynolds," a voice called from beyond the cave. "This is Marshal Jennison. I have a federal warrant for your arrest on charges of theft. Come out peacefully, and no one else needs to get hurt." "Since when is a woman taking her own jewelry theft?" Luke called back. "Since the law says that jewelry belongs to her husband." The marshal replied, "I don't make the laws. Mister, I just enforce them. Send her out and you can ride away." Luke glanced back at Clara. "Your choice. But know this, they'll have to go through me first." Clara thought of all the times she'd run, all the nights she'd spent looking over her shoulder. She thought of Samuel's hands, his voice, the prison of her marriage. Then she looked at Luke, this good man who'd chosen to stand with her against all reason. "I choose to fight," she said. Luke's grin was fierce. "That's my girl." The standoff continued as the sun climbed higher. The marshal's men had good positions in the rocks, but the cave was defensible. Every time they tried to advance, Luke's deadly accuracy drove them back. Clara watched their ammunition, counted their supplies, calculated how long they could hold out. Then she heard it, horses approaching from the opposite direction. Her heart sank. More of Hartley's men, surrounding them. They were trapped, but the gunfire that erupted wasn't directed at them. Shouts of confusion came from the marshal's position. Luke risked a look outside, and his expression shifted to amazement. "I'll be damned," he muttered. "What is it?" Clara demanded. "The cavalry looks like, or at least our version of it." Through the chaos of gunfire and shouting, Clara heard familiar voices. Mrs. Chen's accented English, Jake Morrison's boom, even Deputy Barnes, apparently sober enough to shoot straight. The people of Dust Creek had come. The battle was brief but decisive, caught between the cave and the unexpected reinforcements. The marshal's men quickly surrendered. Luke and Clara emerged to find a dozen townsfolk, all armed, all looking somewhat surprised at their own actions. "Figured you might need help," Jake Morrison said gruffly. "Don't much like outsiders coming into my town, throwing their weight around. Federal marshals have no jurisdiction here anyway," Deputy Barnes added, "not without local cooperation," which they decidedly did not have. Mrs. Chen approached Clara, pressing a small bag into her hands. "For journey," she said simply. "You good seamstress, deserve better than running." Clara's eyes burned with tears she wouldn't shed. These people, who had no reason to risk themselves for her, had chosen to stand against injustice. It was more than she dared hope for. The marshal, nursing a wounded pride more than anything else, glared at them all. This isn't over. Hartley has money, influence. He'll keep sending men, then he'll keep losing them. Luke said, "Clara Reynolds is under the protection of Dust Creek. Spread the word." As the marshal and his remaining men rode off, Clara turned to their unexpected allies. "Why?" she asked. "Why risk this for me?" "Because, Mrs.," Mason said, stepping forward, "we've all been where you are, one way or another, running from something, looking for somewhere to belong. Dust Creek takes care of its own." The ride back to town was surreal. Clara had fled as a fugitive. She returned as something else entirely. The townspeople surrounded them, a protective escort that dared anyone to challenge their claim. That night, as Clara sat in a room at the boarding house, her belongings returned. Her position at Mrs. Chen's assured, she marveled at the turn of events. A knock at her door interrupted her thoughts. Luke stood in the hallway, hat in hand. "Wanted to make sure you were all right. Thanks to you. Thanks to everyone." She studied his face, seeing new lines of exhaustion but also something lighter in his expression. "What now?" "Now," he said, "we stop running. Both of us. Hartley will think twice before sending more men, especially with federal marshals reporting back about armed resistance. And if he does," Luke shrugged, "Dust Creek seems prepared to make a stand." "And us?" Clara asked, her heart beating faster. "What about us?" Luke stepped closer, his hand coming up to cup her cheek with impossible gentleness. "I told you once that the saloon singer feared the night until the dusty cowboy whispered his forbidden desire. Want to know what that desire was?" Clara nodded, unable to speak. "To see her free," he whispered. "To see her safe, to see her happy, and maybe, if she's willing, to see her build a life with a broken-down gunslinger who's finally found something worth fighting for." "She's willing," Clara whispered back. When he kissed her, it was like coming home after a long journey through darkness. Outside, Dust Creek settled into evening, its people going about their lives with the quiet satisfaction of those who'd chosen to do right. And in a small room above the boarding house, two wounded souls began the slow, sweet process of healing together. The night no longer held fear for Clara Reynolds. She'd found her place, her people, her purpose, and in Luke's arms, she'd found the one thing she'd never dared hope for, a love that didn't cage but instead set her free. The abandoned hunting lodge sat nestled between red rock walls, its weathered timbers the same color as the surrounding stone. Luke had remembered it from his years of wandering, a place where men seeking solitude could find shelter without questions. Now it served as their refuge. 2 days' hard ride from Dust Creek, hidden in a maze of canyons that would confound any pursuer. Clara stood at the glassless window, watching the sunrise paint the canyon walls in shades of crimson and gold. The beauty of it took her breath away. So different from the manicured gardens of Boston, so wild and honest. Behind her, she heard Luke stirring in his bedroll, the soft sounds of a man coming awake to danger even in sleep. "Coffee's ready," she said without turning. She'd risen before dawn to tend the small fire, careful to use only the driest wood to minimize smoke. "You should have woken me for watch," Luke said, his voice rough with sleep. "We agreed to take turns. You needed rest more than I did." She turned to find him watching her with those storm-gray eyes that saw too much. "Besides, I couldn't sleep. Too much thinking." He rose, moving with the stiffness of a man who'd spent too many nights on hard ground, and joined her at the window. "Regrets?" "No," Clara said firmly. "Never that. Just wondering what comes next. We can't hide forever. Luke, Samuel won't stop, and eventually, someone will get lucky. We've been fortunate so far, but fortune has a way of running out." Luke was quiet for a moment, sipping the bitter coffee she'd made. "Been thinking the same thing. That's why I want to show you something today, if you're up for a ride." They saddled their horses as the morning grew warmer, the desert coming alive with the buzz of insects and the distant call of quail. Luke led them deeper into the canyon system, following a trail that was barely visible even in full daylight. The path wound upward, switching back on itself, until Clara's mare was breathing hard from the climb. "Where are we going?" she asked, trusting him but curious. "Place I found years ago, after Daniel died. Came here to decide whether I wanted to keep living." He glanced back at her. Found something else instead. They created a rise, and Clara gasped. Before them spread a hidden valley, perhaps 2 miles long and half as wide, carpeted with grass that stayed green from a spring-fed stream running through its center. Cottonwoods lined the water, their leaves whispering in the breeze. At the valley's far end, she could see the remains of old structures, adobe walls returning to earth. "Spanish missionaries? Maybe," Luke explained as they descended. "Or older. Peaceful now, though. Good water, game, shelter from the worst of the weather. Defensible, too. Only 2 ways in, and we came through the hard one." Clara understood what he was offering. Not just a hiding place, but a home. The possibility of it made her chest tight with emotion. They spent the day exploring the valley, Luke showing her the best spots for building, the cave where supplies could be stored, the overlook that commanded views of both entrances. Clara found herself imagining it. A small house by the stream, a garden, maybe even chickens. Simple dreams that felt impossibly precious after so much running. As afternoon shadows lengthened, they sat by the stream, letting the horses graze. Clara had removed her boots and stockings, dangling her feet in the cool water like a child. The simple pleasure of it made her realize how much she'd lost in her years with Samuel, not just freedom, but joy in small things. "I could stay here forever," she said softly. "That's the idea," Luke replied. "But there's something else we need to discuss." He pulled a folded paper from his vest. "Picked this up from a friend in Tucson before all this started. Was planning to use it myself, but now—" Clara took the paper, frowning as she read, "A land claim? 160 acres, including this valley. File it properly, improve the land, and it's yours free and clear after 5 years. Government's eager to settle the territory. They don't ask too many questions about who you were before, but it's in your name. Could be transferred, or—" Luke paused, suddenly seeming younger, uncertain. "Could add another name to it, make it official like." Clara's heart skipped. "Luke Castellan, are you proposing to me?" "Doing it badly, seems like," he said, color rising in his weathered cheeks. "I know it's not much, a hidden valley and a broken-down gunslinger. You deserve better than—" She silenced him with a kiss, pouring all her answer into that contact. When they broke apart, both breathing hard, she smiled. "Yes, to all of it, yes." They stayed in the valley that night, making plans by firelight. The logistics were daunting. Supplies to gather, the claim to file, the constant threat of Samuel's hunters. But for the first time, they were planning a future instead of just surviving the present. The next morning brought clouds building over the mountains, the smell of rain on the wind. They needed to return to the lodge before the storm hit, gather their cached supplies. As they rode out of the valley, Clara looked back once, fixing it in her memory. Soon, if luck held, she'd see it every day. The thought made her smile. They were halfway back to the lodge when Luke suddenly reined up, his hand dropping to his gun. Clara followed his gaze and felt her blood chill. Fresh horse tracks crossed their path, several riders, moving fast toward the lodge. "Could be anyone," Clara said, but she didn't believe it. "Could be," Luke agreed grimly. "But we're going to assume otherwise. Come on." They approached the lodge carefully, Luke scouting ahead while Clara held the horses. He returned with a face like stone. 5 men, professional by their setup. "They're waiting inside. Then we leave," Clara said. "Take what we can carry and—" "No." Luke's voice was firm. "I'm tired of running, and so are you. We do this now, on ground we know, or we spend the rest of our lives looking over our shoulders." Clara knew he was right, but fear clawed at her throat. "What's the plan?" Luke smiled. the dangerous expression she'd first seen in the silver dollar. "You still have that pistol I gave you?" The storm broke as they put their plan into motion. Rain sheeted down, turning the ground to mud, cutting visibility to yards. Luke had positioned Clara in the rocks above the lodge with his rifle, while he circled around to come at the building from behind. "Clara Reynolds," a voice called from inside the lodge. "Or should I say, Mrs. Hartley, your husband's patience is at an end. Come out now and no one gets hurt." Clara sighted down the rifle barrel, rain streaming off her hat. "Counteroffer," she called back. "You leave now, and I don't put a bullet through the window." Harsh laughter answered her. "Little lady, you don't want to—" The rifle cracked, and splinters flew from the window frame. The laughter stopped. "That was a warning," Clara called, working the lever to chamber another round. Luke had taught her well during their flight. "Next one won't be—" She saw movement at another window and fired again, keeping their attention focused on her position, somewhere in the rain. Luke was moving, using the storm as cover. She had to give him time. Return fire erupted from the lodge, forcing her to duck behind the rocks. Bullets whined overhead, chips of stone stinging her face. She counted muzzle flashes. 3 shooters, maybe 4. Where was the 5th man? The answer came from behind her. "Drop the rifle. Mrs. Hartley." Clara froze. The voice was close. Too close. She'd been so focused on the lodge she'd missed the flanking movement. Slowly, she set the rifle down and turned. The man was professional. She'd give him that. Stayed out of arm's reach, gun steady despite the rain. Smart choice. Now, we're going to walk down to the lodge nice and peaceful-like. "I don't think so." The man's eyes widened as Luke materialized from the rain behind him. Before he could turn, Luke's gun butt connected with his skull. The bounty hunter crumpled. "You all right?" Luke asked, never taking his eyes off the lodge. "Better now," Clara managed. "But there's still 4 down there." 3, Luke corrected. "Met one coming up the back trail. He won't be bothering anyone anymore." As if his words were a signal. Gunfire erupted from the lodge, but not directed at them. Shouts of alarm, the crash of breaking furniture, more shots. Then silence, except for the rain. Luke and Clara exchanged glances. "What just happened?" she whispered. Before Luke could answer, a familiar voice called from the lodge. "It's safe now. You can come down." Clara's jaw dropped. "Mrs. Chen." They descended carefully, Luke leading with his gun drawn. Inside the lodge, they found a scene of controlled chaos. 3 bounty hunters sat on the floor, hands bound, looking dazed. Mrs. Chen stood over them, a wicked-looking knife in one hand. Beside her, Jake Morrison held a shotgun, and, incredibly, Deputy Barnes was efficiently tying the last knot. How, was all Clara could manage. Jake grinned. "You didn't think we'd let you face this alone, did you? Been tracking these fellows since they came through Dust Creek yesterday. Figured they were up to no good. Your friends are not subtle." "Mrs." Chen added, cleaning her knife. "Easy to follow, like buffalo in china shop." Deputy Barnes straightened from securing the prisoners. "The territorial governor owes me some favors. I'm thinking these men are going to have a real hard time explaining why they were hunting law-abiding citizens. Might even find themselves guests of the territorial prison for a spell." One of the bounty hunters snarled. "You can't hold us. We have legal papers." "Had," Jake corrected, tossing a handful of documents into the fire. "Funny thing about paper. Burns real easy." Clara felt her knees go weak. Luke's arm came around her, solid and supportive. "It's over," he murmured. "Without those papers, without these men reporting back. Hartley's got nothing. You're free." "We're free," she corrected, leaning into him. "Mrs." Chen approached, her usual stern expression softening slightly. "I bring something else," she said, producing a leather folder. "From Territorial Clerk in Prescott. Friend of friend." Clara opened it with trembling hands. Inside were 2 documents. A certificate of divorce granted on grounds of abandonment and cruelty, somehow backdated 6 months, and a marriage license waiting to be filled out. "How is this possible?" Luke asked, reading over her shoulder. "Money talks. Mrs." Chen said simply, "But justice sometimes talks louder. Many women suffer like Clara. Some of us, we remember. We help when we can." Clara couldn't speak past the lump in her throat. These people, these wonderful, impossible people, had given her more than rescue. They'd given her a legal identity, a clean break from her past. "Now," Jake said, shouldering his shotgun. "What say we get these varmints back to town and let you folks get on with your lives?" As the Dust Creek contingent prepared to leave with their prisoners, Deputy Barnes pulled Luke aside. "That valley you mentioned once, when you were drunk in Maudlin, might be a good place for folks to start fresh. Might be nobody would bother them there." Luke shook his hand. "Might be you're right." After they left, Clara and Luke stood in the rain-washed doorway of the lodge, watching the storm move eastward. The air smelled clean, full of sage and possibility. "So," Luke said eventually, "want to get married in Dust Creek or find a preacher somewhere else?" Clara considered. "Dust Creek." She decided, "Those people are family now. The only family either of us needs." Luke kissed her temple. "Then let's go home." They packed what little they needed, left the rest for whoever might need shelter next. As they rode back toward Dust Creek, the sun broke through the dissipating clouds, turning the wet rocks into jewels. Behind them lay years of fear and running. Ahead waited a hidden valley, a new name, a life built on their own terms. "Luke," Clara said as they created a rise. "Yeah, that desire you whispered, about seeing me free and safe and happy. What about it?" She smiled, feeling lighter than she had in years. "Consider it fulfilled." His answering smile was like sunrise after the longest night. They rode on together, no longer fleeing but moving towards something, a future written by their own hands, in a place where the past couldn't follow. The desert stretched endlessly before them, not empty but full of promise. And Clara Reynolds, soon to be Castellan, was finally, truly, completely unafraid. The narrow canyon trail twisted like a snake between towering walls of red sandstone, barely wide enough for their horses to pass single file. Clara's mare picked her way carefully over loose scree, every hoofbeat echoing off the rock faces. Behind her, Luke rode watchful, his rifle across his saddle, eyes scanning the rim above for any sign of movement. They'd been riding hard for 2 days since leaving the lodge, pushing deeper into the maze of canyons that would lead them to the valley. The urgency in Luke's movements told Clara he sensed danger still, despite their victory over the bounty hunters. "How much further?" she called back, her voice barely carrying over the clatter of hooves on stone. "Should clear this canyon by noon," Luke replied. "Then it's open country for a spell before we reach the valley entrance." Open country. Exposed ground where riders could be seen for miles. Clara suppressed a shiver that had nothing to do with the morning chill. They'd come too far to be caught now. The canyon began to widen as the sun climbed higher, shadows retreating up the walls like dark water draining away. Clara was just beginning to relax when Luke's sharp whistle made her rein up short. "Riders," he said quietly, pointing to a dust plume rising beyond the canyon mouth. "Coming fast." Clara's hand found the pistol at her hip. "How many?" "Can't tell from here. Could be travelers. Could be—" He didn't finish, but Clara heard what he didn't say. Could be more of Samuel's men. They found cover behind a cluster of boulders near the canyon exit, positioning themselves with clear sight lines. Clara checked her weapon. The movement's automatic now after Luke's patient teaching. 6 shots. She'd make them count if needed. The dust cloud resolved into shapes. 5 riders pushing their mounts hard across the desert floor. As they drew closer, Clara's heart sank. These weren't random travelers. They rode with purpose, spread in a search pattern that spoke of military or law enforcement training. "Federal marshals again?" she whispered. Luke studied them through the telescope he'd pulled from his saddlebag. "No, worse, Pinkertons, by the look of them. Private badges don't have to follow the same rules as real law." The riders were heading straight for the canyon entrance. In minutes, they'd be on top of them. Clara and Luke exchanged glances, both understanding their limited options. Fight here and risk being pinned down, or try to retreat deeper into the canyon and possibly trap themselves. We could parley, Clara suggested without much hope. Try to... The crack of a rifle shot cut her off. Rock chips exploded from the boulder inches from her head. Someone had spotted them. So much for talking, Luke muttered, returning fire. The Pinkertons scattered, seeking their own cover as bullets flew. Clara sighted on a man trying to flank their position and fired, her shot driving him back behind his horse, the air filled with gun smoke and the sharp reports of weapons. Clara! Luke's warning came just as she saw movement above, more riders appearing on the canyon rim, trying to get the high ground. They'd walked into a carefully planned ambush. Back into the canyon, Luke ordered, "Move!" They scrambled for their horses as bullets whined overhead. Clara's mare danced nervously, fighting the reins, but she managed to mount and spur the animal back the way they'd come. Behind them, shouts and more gunfire echoed off the walls. They rode recklessly, taking chances on the narrow trail that could have ended in disaster. But disaster was also pounding after them in the form of professional manhunters who wouldn't stop until they collected their bounty. A wider section of canyon appeared ahead, a place where ancient floods had carved out a bowl in the rock. Luke pointed to a side trail barely visible in the shadows. "Up there! Quickly!" They urged their tired horses up the steep path, stones rattling down behind them. The trail led to a ledge perhaps 30 feet above the main canyon floor, with an overhang that provided some shelter. It was a defensive position, but also a potential trap. "They'll pin us here," Clara said, dismounting and pulling her rifle from its scabbard. "Maybe," Luke agreed, already positioning himself at the ledge's edge. "Or maybe they'll learn what happened to the last group that cornered us." The Pinkertons approached cautiously, having learned respect for their quarry's marksmanship. Clara counted 8 men now, the original 5 plus 3 who'd been on the rim. Professional killers. Everyone. "Mrs. Hartley." The voice that called up was cultured, Eastern. "I'm William Thornton, Pinkerton National Detective Agency. Your husband has authorized me to use whatever force necessary to return you, but I'd prefer to avoid further bloodshed." "Then you should leave," Clara called back. "I'm not going back. Not now, not ever. The law says otherwise. Ma'am, you're his legal wife." "Was," Clara interrupted. "The divorce was granted in Prescott. I'm a free woman. Mr. Thornton." There was a pause. "I'm afraid Mr. Hartley doesn't recognize any divorce. He's obtained injunctions in 3 states. You come with us, or we take you. Those are the only options." Luke spoke up then, his voice carrying cold authority. "Here's a third option. You and your men turn around and ride out. Tell Hartley his wife died in these canyons. Tragic accident. Happens all the time in rough country." "Can't do that, friend. We have a reputation to maintain." "So do I," Luke replied, and fired. The shot was precisely placed, knocking Thornton's hat from his head. The message was clear. That could have been a killing shot. What followed was a deadly game of patience. The Pinkertons tried various approaches, rushing the trail, attempting to scale the cliff face, even trying to smoke them out with a fire that the canyon winds quickly dispersed. Each attempt was met with accurate fire from above, forcing them back. As the afternoon wore on, Clara noticed Luke favoring his left arm. "You're hurt," she said during a lull. "Ricochet." He admitted. "Just a graze? I've had worse." But Clara could see the blood seeping through his shirt, the tightness around his eyes. They couldn't hold out forever. Their water was running low, ammunition limited. The Pinkertons knew it too. She could see them settling in for a siege. That's when they heard it, a sound that made everyone freeze. The distant rumble of thunder, but from a cloudless sky. Luke's face went pale. "Flash flood," he breathed. "Rain in the high country. Everyone in the canyon needs to get out now." Even as he spoke, the rumble grew louder. The Pinkertons below were looking around uncertainly, torn between their quarry and the growing threat. "Thornton!" Luke shouted. "Get your men out! Flood's coming!" Some of the Pinkertons were already moving, survival instinct overcoming professional duty, but Thornton and 3 others held their ground, guns still trained on the ledge. "Nice try," Thornton called back. "But we're not falling for—" He never finished. The flood came around the canyon bend like a brown wall of destruction, carrying trees, boulders, and everything else in its path. Thornton and his remaining men had seconds to realize their fatal error before the water took them. Clara watched in horror as men and horses were swept away like toys. The roar was deafening, the canyon transforming in moments from dry stone to raging river. Their ledge was high enough to be safe, but spray from the churning water below soaked them both. "The horses!" Clara cried, but Luke was already moving, pulling their mounts back against the cliff face where a small overhang provided shelter. They huddled there, watching nature's fury remake the canyon floor. The flood lasted perhaps 20 minutes, gradually diminishing to a fast-moving but navigable stream. When it was over, there was no sign of the Pinkertons except a single hat caught in the rocks. "Dead?" Clara asked quietly. "Maybe some made it out." Luke said, "The ones who ran early. Thornton?" He shook his head. "Man should have listened." They waited another hour before attempting the treacherous descent. The trail was water-slicked and partially washed out, but their horses were mountain-bred and sure-footed. They picked their way down carefully, finally reaching the transformed canyon floor. "We need to move," Luke said, scanning the area. "If any survived, they'll regroup, and Hartley will send more." They rode through the afternoon, following the now flowing stream. The flood had changed the landscape, erasing old trails and creating new ones. It would make trekking them harder, a small blessing from a terrible event. As evening approached, they reached the entrance to another canyon system. Luke studied the markers only he could see, then nodded. "This way. We can reach the valley by dawn if we push through the night." "Your arm needs tending," Clara protested. "Later," he said, "when we're safe." They rode through darkness lit by stars and a crescent moon. Clara dozed in the saddle, trusting her mare to follow Luke's horse. She dreamed of water walls and men's screams, starting awake more than once. "Easy," Luke murmured. "Just dreams. We're almost there." Dawn was painting the sky pink and gold when they crested the final rise. Below them spread the hidden valley, peaceful and untouched. The stream still ran clear here. The cottonwoods rustled in the morning breeze. It looked like paradise after the violence they'd survived. "No one followed?" Clara asked. "No one could. That flood wiped out our tracks for miles. And the Pinkertons—" Luke's voice was grim. "They won't be reporting back. Hartley will think we vanished into the desert. Might send more men, but they'll be searching blind now." They descended into the valley as the sun climbed higher. Luke swayed in his saddle, and Clara saw his shirt was soaked with blood. The graze was worse than he'd admitted. "Off the horse," she commanded. "Now, Luke, you're no good to me dead." He managed a weak smile. "Yes, ma'am." Clara got him to the shade of a cottonwood, then set about doing what needed doing. Water from the stream to clean the wound, deeper than a graze, but not life-threatening if kept clean. Whiskey from Luke's saddlebag to disinfect it, making him hiss through clenched teeth. Bandages torn from her spare shirt. "You'd make a good field nurse," Luke said when she finished. "I'd rather make a good wife," Clara replied, "one who doesn't have to patch bullet holes in her husband. Soon as we can find a preacher," he promised. "Though after this, might be a while before we can show our faces in any town." Clara looked around the valley, their valley, and felt a strange peace settle over her. "We have everything we need right here. The rest can wait." They set up a simple camp by the stream, too exhausted for anything elaborate. As Clara prepared a meal from their supplies, she thought about the men who'd died in the flood. She felt no guilt. They'd chosen their path when they accepted blood money, but she grieved for the waste of it. lives thrown away for one man's obsession. "Do you think he'll ever stop?" she asked Luke as they ate. "Hardly. Maybe. Men like him. They like their possessions close where they can control them. You're beyond his reach now. Eventually, he'll find some other poor woman to torment. I pray she has your strength to escape," Clara said softly. Luke took her hand. "She'll need more than strength. She'll need luck, friends, and maybe a broken-down gunslinger with nothing to lose." "You're not broken," Clara said firmly. "Bent, maybe. Scarred, definitely. But not broken. Broken men don't fight for strangers. They don't risk everything for a chance at redemption." "Is that what this is? Redemption?" "Among other things," Clara said, squeezing his hand. "Love, hope, a future. All the things we thought we'd lost." They spent the day resting, tending wounds both physical and spiritual. As evening came, they walked the valley together, planning where to build, where to plant, where to make their stand against the world. "It won't be easy," Luke warned. "Starting from nothing, no help from towns, always watching for trouble. But it will be ours," Clara said. "Built with our hands, defended with our courage. That's worth any hardship." That night, they slept under the stars, the valley walls standing sentinel around them. Clara dreamed not of floods and violence, but of gardens growing, children laughing, a life made whole through struggle and love. When she woke, Luke was watching the sunrise paint the canyon walls. His arm was still bandaged, but the fever had broken. He looked at peace for the first time since she'd known him. "What are you thinking?" she asked. "That Daniel would have liked this place," he said. "Would have called it a good spot to make a stand." "Then that's what we'll do." Clara said, "Make our stand. Together." The sun rose fully, banishing the last shadows from their hidden valley. Somewhere beyond the canyon walls, Samuel Hartley raged and plotted. But here, in this secret place carved by time and water, Clara Reynolds and Luke Castellan began the work of building not just a home, but a life. The running was over. The living could finally begin. The sun hung low over Dust Creek, painting Main Street in shades of amber and rust. Clara stood beside Luke at the edge of town, her hand steady in his despite the hammering of her heart. 3 weeks in the valley had given them time to heal, to plan, and to decide that hiding forever was no life at all. Now they'd return to face whatever judgment awaited. "Ready?" Luke asked, his voice low. Clara lifted her chin, finding the steel within herself that had carried her this far. "I'm done running. Whatever comes, we face it." They walked down Main Street like gunslingers approaching a showdown. Word of their return spread faster than wildfire. Curtains twitched, doors opened. Whispers followed in their wake. By the time they reached the sheriff's office, half the town seemed to be watching. Deputy Barnes looked up from his desk as they entered, his weathered face showing no surprise. "Figured you two would show up eventually. Take a seat. We've got things to discuss." "If you're planning to arrest us," Luke began, but Barnes waved him off. "Arrest you for what? Far as I know, you're both law-abiding citizens." He pulled out a telegram, sliding it across the desk. "This came 2 days ago, from Boston." Clara's hands trembled as she took the paper. The message was brief, but its impact profound. "Samuel Hartley deceased. Stop. Carriage accident. Stop. Estate in probate. Stop. Previous claims void. Stop. He's dead," Clara whispered, hardly daring to believe it. "As a doornail," Barnes confirmed. "Seems he was racing through the streets, probably drunk again, when his carriage overturned. Broke his neck. His lawyers sent word to call off all pursuit." Clara felt Luke's hand tighten on hers. Samuel was gone. The shadow that had chased her across a continent had vanished like smoke. She waited to feel something, relief, joy, even sadness for the waste of a life. Instead, she felt only a strange emptiness, as if a weight she'd carried so long had become part of her. "There's more," Barnes continued. "Judge Prescott wants to see you both. Something about legitimizing your land claim and other matters." 2 hours later, They sat in Judge William Crawford's chambers in Prescott, the territorial capital bustling beyond the windows. Crawford was a small man with sharp eyes that missed nothing, the kind of judge who'd brought order to the frontier through a combination of legal knowledge and practical wisdom. "Miss Reynolds, Mr. Castellan," he began, shuffling papers. "I've reviewed your case with interest. The land claim is straightforward enough. I'll approve it today. But there are other matters to address." He produced a thick envelope. "It seems Mr. Hartley's death has created an unusual situation. You were still legally his wife when he died. Despite the divorce proceedings initiated here, that makes you his widow and primary heir." Clara recoiled. "I don't want his money, not a cent of it." "Understandable," Crawford said. "But consider this. Hartley hurt many people over the years. His factories employed children. His tenements were fire traps. His business practices destroyed honest competitors. You could do considerable good with his fortune." Luke spoke up. "What are you suggesting?" "Judge," Crawford smiled, "I'm suggesting that sometimes justice comes in unexpected forms. Mrs. Hartley or Miss Reynolds, if you prefer, you have an opportunity to transform blood money into something beneficial. Schools, hospitals, fair wages for workers, turn his legacy of cruelty into one of kindness." Clara sat silent, wrestling with the idea. Taking Samuel's money felt like accepting a final connection to him. But the judge was right. That money could help people Samuel had hurt. "I'll think about it," she said finally. "Do that. In the meantime," Crawford produced another document. "There's the matter of this marriage license. I understand you two wish to wed?" "Yes, sir," Luke said firmly. "Good. I'll perform the ceremony myself if you'd like. Call it personal interest in seeing a happy ending to this saga." They were married that afternoon in the judge's chambers, with Deputy Barnes and Mrs. Chen as witnesses. The shopkeeper had traveled from Dust Creek specifically for the occasion. Clara wore a simple blue dress Mrs. Chen had brought, and Luke had managed to find a clean shirt and string tie. It wasn't the elaborate ceremony she'd once dreamed of as a girl, but it was perfect in its simplicity and sincerity. "By the power vested in me, by the territory of Arizona," Judge Crawford intoned, "I now pronounce you husband and wife. Mr. Castellan, you may kiss your bride." Luke's kiss was gentle, a promise of all the tomorrows they'd fought to reach. When they parted, Clara saw tears in Mrs. Chen's eyes, though the older woman would deny it later. That evening found them back in Dust Creek, the $Silver Saloon hosting an impromptu celebration. Jake Morrison had declared drinks on the house, and it seemed the entire town had turned out. Clara found herself overwhelmed by the warmth of their reception, these people who'd risked themselves for her, who'd chosen justice over law. "Never thought I'd see a happy ending in this God-forsaken place," Tom Brennan said, approaching with uncharacteristic sobriety. "I owe you an apology, Mrs. Castellan, for how I acted before. We all have our demons." "Tom," Clara replied, "the trick is not letting them win." As the evening wore on, Luke found himself in conversation with several of the town's leaders. "That valley of yours," Mayor Henderson said. "Barnes tells me it's good land, defensible, water rights, decent soil." "It is," Luke confirmed, wondering where this was heading. "Town's been growing, families moving in, businesses expanding. We've been looking for a place to establish a satellite community, somewhere folks could homestead without being too far from civilization." Henderson paused. "Your valley could anchor that, create a proper settlement, with you and Clara as founding members." Luke considered it. He and Clara had planned for isolation, but perhaps that wasn't necessary anymore. "I'd need to discuss it with my wife." "Of course, but think about it. Strength in numbers, and all that." Later, Luke found Clara on the saloon's back porch, taking a break from the celebration. The desert night was cool, stars brilliant overhead. "Henderson wants to build a settlement around our valley," he told her, Clara was quiet for a moment. Part of me wants to say no, to keep it just for us, hidden and safe. But we're not the only ones running from something, not the only ones who need a fresh start. She looked at him. What do you think Daniel would say? Luke smiled. He'd say we were fools to try farming that land alone anyway. Boy never could resist pointing out my impractical notions. Then maybe we should listen to him. They stood together, looking out at the desert that had been both adversary and sanctuary. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, deciding about Samuel's fortune, planning a community, building a life that neither had dared imagine possible. Any regrets? Luke asked. Only one. Clara said, I wish we'd found each other sooner. Think of all the time we wasted being afraid. Wasn't wasted. Luke disagreed. Made us who we are. And who we are is exactly who we need to be. The celebration continued inside, laughter and music spilling into the night. But out on the porch, Clara and Luke stood in comfortable silence. Two souls who'd traveled through darkness to find light in each other. Judge Crawford had been as good as his word. The next morning, a package arrived containing the deed to their land, officially registered, along with a letter from Samuel's lawyers. The estate was more extensive than Clara had imagined. Factories, properties, investments across 3 states. The lawyers awaited her instructions. You could ignore it, Luke suggested as they sat in their room at the boarding house. Let the lawyers sort it out. Or I could do what the judge suggested. Clara said slowly, use it to help people. Create the kind of world Samuel tried to prevent. She made her decision then, penning a long letter to the lawyers with detailed instructions. The factories would be sold to the workers as cooperatives. The tenements would be renovated or rebuilt to safe standards. Trust funds would be established for schools and hospitals in the neighborhoods Samuel had exploited. She would keep only enough to help establish the new settlement in their valley. He'd hate this, she said as she sealed the letter. Hate that I'm using his money to undo his harm. Good, Luke said simply. They prepared to leave for the valley the next day, but now with a difference. 3 other families would follow within the week, with more to come. The hidden valley would become a haven not just for them but for others seeking fresh starts. The morning of their departure, Clara stood once more on the Silver Dollar's stage. Jake had asked her to sing one last time, and she'd agreed. But this time, she sang not as entertainment but as celebration. Her voice rose clear and strong, singing Amazing Grace with a conviction born of lived experience. I once was lost, but now am found, she sang, her eyes finding Luke in the crowd. Was blind, but now I see. The saloon was silent when she finished, then erupted in applause. Clara stepped down from the stage for the last time, walking through the crowd to take her husband's offered arm. They rode out of Dust Creek as the sun climbed higher, but now they weren't alone. A small convoy followed. The Chen family, ready to establish a new store, the Millers with their 3 children, seeking farmland, old prospector Pete Williams, who swore the valley's streams might hide gold. From running alone to leading a parade, Luke murmured, life takes strange turns. The best ones are unexpected. Clara replied, as they entered the canyon that led to their valley. Clara thought about the journey that had brought them here, from a Boston mansion to a frontier saloon, from fear to freedom, from solitude to community. The woman who'd fled in terror would hardly recognize the one who now rode confidently toward her future. Luke, she said as the valley opened before them, green and welcoming. Yeah? Remember what you whispered that night about your forbidden desire? To see you free, safe and happy, he recalled. Clara smiled, gesturing at the valley, their companions, the life spreading before them. Mission accomplished, Mr. Castellan. He laughed, the sound echoing off the canyon walls. Just getting started, Mrs. Castellan, just getting started. They descended into the valley as the morning sun bathed everything in golden light. Behind them came the sounds of children laughing, wagon wheels creaking, voices raised in excitement at the sight of their new home. the hidden valley would hide no more. It would become a beacon of hope, a testament to the power of courage and community. As they reached the spot where they'd make their home, Clara turned in her saddle to look back at the pequeño caravan following them. Each face showed the same expression she'd once worn, hope mixed with fear, determination shadowed by doubt. But they'd come anyway, trusting in the promise of a new beginning. "Welcome home," she called out, her voice carrying clearly in the still morning air. "Welcome to Haven Valley." The name came unbidden, but it felt right. This would be their haven, their sanctuary, their proof that even in the harshest desert, life could bloom if given the chance. Clara had spent so long fearing the night, but now she understood that darkness was just another word for possibility. And dawn always came for those brave enough to wait for it. 3 months had passed since the founding of Haven Valley. The small settlement had grown from a handful of tents to a proper community with cabins, a general store run by the Chens, and even a small schoolhouse where Clara taught the children their letters. The morning sun found her standing on the hill overlooking it all, Luke beside her, both marveling at what they'd built. "Never thought I'd see you as a schoolmarm," Luke teased, his arm comfortable around her waist. "Never thought I'd see you as a farmer," Clara countered, gesturing at the neat rows of corn stretching toward the stream. "Yet here we are." The transformation had been remarkable for both of them. Luke's hands, once quick to his gun, now worked the soil with patient determination. Clara's voice, once raised in saloons, now guided young minds through primers and arithmetic. They'd found peace in purpose, healing in the simple rhythm of daily life. "Mrs. Castellan." Young Tommy Miller came running up the hill, breathless with excitement. "Riders coming from Dust Creek." Luke's hand moved instinctively toward where his gun used to rest, then dropped. Old habits died hard, but they were learning. Together, they walked down to meet the visitors. Deputy Barnes led the small group, his badge glinting in the morning light. Beside him rode Judge Crawford, and, surprisingly, a woman Clara didn't recognize. Elderly but straight-backed, with eyes that seemed familiar. "Judge Crawford," Luke greeted. "Deputy Barnes, welcome to Haven Valley." "Good to see you thriving," Crawford said, dismounting with practiced ease. "I've brought someone who's been looking for you, Mrs. Castellan. May I introduce Mrs. Margaret Reynolds, your aunt from San Francisco." Clara's breath caught. "Aunt Margaret, but how—" The older woman dismounted, tears streaming down her weathered face. "Clara, my dear child, when I heard what happened, what that monster did to you, I've been searching for months." They embraced, Clara breathing in the familiar scent of lavender that brought back memories of happier times. Margaret had been her mother's sister, the one relative who'd opposed her marriage to Samuel. "I should have fought harder," Margaret whispered. "Should have stopped the wedding. Can you forgive an old woman's cowardice?" "There's nothing to forgive," Clara assured her. "You tried to warn me. I was too young, too stubborn to listen." They retired to Clara and Luke's cabin, where over coffee and Mrs. Chen's fresh bread, Margaret explained her journey. "When Samuel's death made the papers, I hired investigators to find you. I needed to know you were safe, that you'd found some measure of happiness. More than some measure," Clara said, taking Luke's hand. "I found everything." Margaret smiled, the expression transforming her stern features. "I can see that, which brings me to my second purpose." She produced a leather portfolio. "Your mother's inheritance. Your father kept it from you, but it was always rightfully yours. Not a fortune like Samuel's, but enough to secure your future." Clara stared at the documents. Her mother's family had been merchants, comfortable if not wealthy. The inheritance would indeed secure their future, allow them to expand the settlement, build the school properly, perhaps even establish the hospital she'd dreamed of. Additionally, Crawford interjected, "The territorial government has approved Haven Valley as an official township. You'll need to elect a mayor, establish proper governance, but you're now officially on the map." Luke laughed. From Hidden Valley to official town in 3 months. That has to be some kind of record. The rest of the day was spent in celebration and planning. Margaret toured the settlement, delighting in meeting the families who'd gathered around her niece. That evening, the entire community gathered for a feast in the open area that served as their town square. As the sun set, painting the canyon walls in brilliant hues, Clara found herself back on the stage, this time a simple platform built for town meetings. But tonight, they'd asked her to sing. "This isn't a saloon," she protested laughingly. "No, Mrs." Chen agreed. "Is home better place for music?" So Clara sang, her voice carrying across the valley, not the mournful ballads of her saloon days, but songs of hope and homecoming. The children sat transfixed, the adults swayed to familiar melodies, and even stern Aunt Margaret wiped away tears. As the final notes faded, Luke stood. "I'd like to propose a toast," he said, raising his cup. "To second chances, to the courage to run when we must, and the wisdom to stand when we can. To Haven Valley, and all who find shelter here." "To Haven Valley," the crowd echoed. Later, as the celebration continued, Clara and Luke slipped away to their favorite spot by the stream. The sounds of laughter and music drifted on the night air, punctuated by the eternal song of water over stone. "Any regrets about the quiet life we planned?" Clara asked. "Not one." Luke replied, "This is better. We're not just saving ourselves anymore. We're building something that will last." Clara leaned into him, feeling the solid warmth of his presence. "Do you think Daniel would be proud?" "I know he would. He always said I was meant for more than chasing outlaws. Took me a while to figure out what that meant." They sat in comfortable silence, watching stars emerge in the darkening sky. Somewhere in the settlement, a baby cried and was quickly soothed. A dog barked. Normal sounds of normal life, precious in their ordinariness. "I've been thinking," Clara said eventually, "about what you said that night in Dust Creek, about the saloon singer who feared the night. What about it?" "I don't fear it anymore," she said simply. "The night, the future, none of it. How can I, when I know that whatever darkness comes, I won't face it alone?" Luke kissed her temple. "Never alone, not anymore." As they made their way back to the settlement, Clara paused to look back at the journey that had brought them here. From fear to freedom, from solitude to community, from desperation to hope. The woman who'd fled Boston in terror had become someone she hardly recognized. Teacher, leader, wife, and soon, she suspected, mother. The saloon singer had indeed feared the night, until a dusty cowboy showed her that darkness was just another word for possibility. And in that possibility, they'd built not just a life, but a legacy, a place where others could find the same transformation, the same hope. Haven Valley slept peacefully under the stars, its people secure in the knowledge that they'd found not just shelter, but home. And in a small cabin by the stream, Clara Castellan lay in her husband's arms, listening to the night sounds that had once terrified her, now hearing only the music of a life fully lived. The forbidden desire had been spoken, the promise fulfilled. They were free, they were safe, and they were happy. In the end, that was the greatest victory of all, not just surviving the storm, but learning to dance in the rain that followed. Thank you so much for listening to this Wild West love story. I hope Clara and Luke's journey touched your heart as much as it touched mine while sharing it. Where are you listening from today? I'd love to hear from listeners around the world. Drop a comment below and let's connect. Don't forget to subscribe to From Wild West channel for more tales of courage, romance, and redemption from the American frontier. What did you think of Clara's transformation? Share your thoughts. I read every comment and love hearing your perspectives on these characters who face their fears and find love against all odds.